Hello, I'm James McCullough, and I'm in the library at the Birmingham Oratory. With me today is Fr Guy Nicholls, an Oratorian, and we're going to be speaking about Newman and his life after Littlemore in Oxford. Thank you very much, Father, for speaking to us today.
It's a very great pleasure.
So, Father, we'd like to start the story really by going to Rome, and Newman had gone to Rome after Littlemore, joined the Oratorians. How did this come about?
It was very interesting, really, because when Newman first became a Catholic in 1845, he wasn't immediately sure exactly what he was going to do, even to the point of not being sure whether he would be a priest. I think that was probably just wisdom on his part, because he knew that you can't anticipate the judgment of the church and a vocation. It has to be the church that decides. No. So he may have been thinking about various possibilities. But he did, of course, I dare say, after a great deal of prayer, of course, and a certain amount of guidance, he did decide that he would pursue studies for the priesthood. He was encouraged to do so. And he thought about the possibilities that lay ahead for himself, including the possibility of joining an existing religious order, because he reckoned that if he were to be ordained as a secular priest, as a diocesan secular priest, well, of course, this is before the establishment of dioceses. It would have been a vicariate, but nonetheless, as a secular priest, he would have been on his own.
Yes.
He would have been separated from his friends, with whom, over the years in Oxford and Littlemore and Maryvale, after his conversion, he'd been used to working closely. They were a great assistant to him. And so he wanted to maintain this spirit of fellowship. And also he looked for something that would enable him to contribute something distinctive to the English Catholic scene. One of the things that he recognized almost immediately was, as he put it, the need for education among Catholics. Because he recognized that one of the consequences of the whole of the centuries of persecution, and indeed, the very short time that had elapsed since emancipation, was that there's very little provision made for Catholic education, certainly to a high level. And of course, in those days, Catholics weren't able to go to university. They were the only the Oxford and Cambridge, because they're both of them still at that stage firmly Anglican institutions.
And I believe the bishops even discouraged Catholics from going in those days.
That, of course, came later.
Right.
Once Oxford and Cambridge had opened themselves to non-Anglicans, then, of course, it became necessary for the bishops to decide whether or not they thought it was safe for Catholics to go. And, of course, they did, in fact, decide that it would not be a good idea. Thereby hangs another tale, of course, because that involves the whole relationship between Newman and Oxford as a Catholic. But then that's way down the line. But at this stage, of course, he was looking for something that would enable him and his friends to continue to work together with an educational kind of focus to it. So he did look at various religious orders. He looked at the Rosminians, because one of his companions in Littlemore, William Lockhart, had become a Rosminian. And he went to visit him over at Gracedew. And he thought, this is very nice. So the Rosminians are quite a small group, but he wasn't quite sure whether they were really the right kind of order for him. He looked at the Jesuits, but he wasn't sure, again, whether they would be able to continue to work together. Once they were under the obedience of the general rule of the order, he thought it was quite likely that they would be made to work separately, of course. He wanted something there they could retain a certain degree of autonomy. And so it was Bishop Wiseman, as he still then was, who said, you ought to look at the oratory. Wiseman, of course, had spent many years in Rome as a student and then as the rector of the Venerabile, the Venerable English College. So he knew Rome extremely well. And there were long-standing historical links between the Venerabile and the oratory. Went back to the time of St Philip himself.
Right.
So the connection there led Wiseman to think, since he knew that Newman was looking for something that involved a certain degree of community life, which would be a support to the mission they were going to undertake, the oratory might well offer the kind of structures and focus of work, priestly work, which would suit him. So Newman went and visited the Chiesa Nuova, the church in Rome where the oratory was situated, which had been built specially for the oratory under St Philip's direction. And he witnessed there some of the Oratorian exercises. Of course, one of the features of the oratory, right from the time of St Philip, was the idea of combining prayer with preaching and music.
Right, I see.
And all of this, of course, was interwoven with the life of the sacraments, so that St Philip's own mission, which is exactly the way that Newman himself would subsequently come to describe it, St Philip's mission, was to bring people, the ordinary lay people of the city of Rome, into a deeper life of prayer and the sacraments. So he would encourage them to confession, particularly to confession, as a way of preparing them then also for communion and a deeper sense of reverence for the presence of our Lord and for the life of our Lord in the soul that comes through Holy Communion and the bond of unity in the church. So all of that was something which St Philip had already established in the oratory as it was founded by him and as it continued to function. And then the musical side was part of the whole process that St Philip understood to be a deep human instinct, the love of beauty, above all through music, even more than through the arts, although he did have a very strong sense of art as well, but music more than anything else, because that was more closely associated with prayer, the practice of prayer. And so his musical exercises, one of his Oratorian exercises, were very largely an interweaving of music and of preaching.
And fast forward a little bit, I mean, this is reflected in some of the wonderful hymns that he composed, namely the
Cardinal is
yes,
Newman. Yes, indeed. Well, of course, interestingly enough, Newman's hymns were not generally, the ones that we know, were not generally written for the oratory. But there are, in fact, a large number of lesser-known hymns, which are no longer sung very frequently, which he did specifically write, and indeed he also chose the music for the purposes of the devotions of the oratory. And he was actually quite eclectic when it came to choosing music, because one of his own passions as a musician, because he was in fact an extremely accomplished musician, as a violinist particularly, and one of his great passions as a musician was the music of Beethoven.
I see.
Which is quite interesting, because although we tend to think of the Cardinal as having really rather standard musical tastes for his day, in fact, when it came to Beethoven, he was quite avant-garde, as Beethoven himself was, and came to know and love the music of Beethoven while Beethoven himself was still alive, still a contemporary composer, which is an extraordinary thought, of course, when you think of him as an ancient historical figure, really.
Yes, indeed.
So Newman actually chose melodies from some of Beethoven's instrumental compositions and adapted them with a greater or lesser degree of success as music for Oratorian devotions.
That's fascinating.
So some of those which we can still see, but then they're not generally used quite so much now.
No.
But that was part of the way that he adapted the whole of St Philip's approach to music, because Philip had two kind of weapons in his armory where music was concerned. One was the popular songs, laudi, as they were called, songs of praise, which came from his Florentine background. So Florence in the late 15th century, under the influence of people like Savonarola, had developed this system of popular songs of devotion, which could be sung not particularly in church, but sung in processions, in the streets, in devotions at home, to vernacular texts rather than Latin liturgical ones. Right. And so this is, of course, where the idea of having specially composed vernacular texts came into Newman's particular musical program. And the other was, of course, the use of the talents of some of the best known professional musicians of his day. So many of the greatest musicians of 16th century Rome became personally attached to St Philip and to his way of using music in devotional as well as liturgical life. So people like Palestrina, Tomás Luis de Victoria, the two brothers Anerio, Felice and Joan Francesco, and also one of the priests of the oratory as well, who's quite strongly influenced by this. And another important Florentine composer, not so well known as the others I mentioned, called Animuccia, who spent a long time in association with St Philip. These wrote very important liturgical music. Of this, of a fully professional kind as well. So Philip was using both of these, and this is something which went on in the life of the oratory, and something therefore which Newman encountered when in 1847 he was exploring the oratory, and early in 1847, of course, he decided after some deliberation, because I think his initial reaction was, this is more like a concert than it is like a devotional exercise. And I think there was a reason for that. There is evidence that in the 1840s, some aspects of the oratory's own practice was slightly in decline. And there were historical reasons why the oratory had not fully recovered from the Napoleonic Wars.
I see.
And I think that they were really trying to live on some of their cultural capital.
Right, yeah.
And it wasn't quite as successful as perhaps it would have been if he'd been there in the 17th or 18th centuries, when we do have some interesting records of people's visits to Rome, including the Englishman John Evelyn, who writes very interestingly about his experience of the Chiesa Nuova and the musical life that he encountered there. And that's much more like, I think, what Newman was hoping to find. And I think he saw the possibilities. And he recognized that Wiseman's advice to him to look to the oratory was in fact extremely cleverly and sensibly thought out. So he did actually acknowledge his debt to Wiseman. He wrote, once he'd been through the novitiate, a fairly accelerated novitiate, because obviously all this had to be done in a very short space of time, and under the direction and permission of Pope Pius IX, who encouraged the whole project, Newman wrote back to Wiseman and said, we are going to become Oratorians, and we have to thank you, your lordship, for the advice that you gave us. You were quite right. You saw exactly the possibilities. And one of the other things, of course, that apart from the whole devotional and liturgical life and the musical aspect, was the way in which, as a community of priests, they were not a religious order, and therefore they weren't vowed to poverty and common ownership of goods. Every priest owned his own property, but they worked together like, as he envisaged it, rather like in the ancient world, the difference between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Athenians fighting as individual men within a kind of a disciplined body, but not like the Spartans who fought like a phalanx, where everyone was just like a single block. And he thought the Jesuits were like the Spartans, and the Oratorians were like the Athenians.
That's a great analogy.
Yes. Though he did say, of course, I'm not suggesting that the Oratorians were as great as the Athenians were, just that the style of their mission in many ways rather reflects that freedom to act. So everyone was allowed to use his own talents and his own wealth in precisely the way that he saw fit. What they did, of course, was to come together each day for the most important acts of prayer and also recreation. So they would have evening prayer and devotions in common, and morning prayers and devotions as well. But they would also have meals in common.
Yes.
So, as well as the chapel in which they would meet for oratory prayers, and sometimes that chapel was not necessarily an ecclesiastical space. As we would understand by a chapel, it might have been a large room without any particular liturgical or religious imagery in the same sense as we would understand it, just a large room for meeting in. There was also the refectory for eating in, and that became an important part. And Newman, when he set up the oratory finally permanently here in Edgbaston, after it been established at Maryvale and then been into central Birmingham where there was a big mission we can talk about as well. When he came here permanently in 1852, this is where he actually wrote an important chapter address to the brethren about the importance of the refectory as a symbol of their common life, and having, as he put it, a quasi-sacramental purpose to it.
Yes.
Because he saw the whole religious aspect of even of ordinary bodily things like being fed.
Yes.
And along with being fed bodily, there was being fed by the word.
Right.
Because part of the practice of reading at meals is still conducted in Oratorian houses to this day.
Yes.
So that at formal meals, generally in the evening, there is reading from the life of St Philip, which is devised by the cardinal for the purpose in daily kind of excerpts, and then a book, a current book of something of historical or cultural or religious interest, which can be then read out day by day in continuous form, so that it gives some nourishment to the mind, just as one's also getting nourishment to the body.
Right.
So all this kind of balance was very much what Newman appreciated, and it had the other advantage for him that it very much brought to mind, when he saw it in action in Rome, the life of his Oxford College, because obviously he'd lived by this stage for well over 20 years as a don. As a celibate don. True. Remember that all the dons in Oxford were celibates.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So they lived very much a community life, not like modern Oxbridge dons,
no.
who live all in houses and they come together, perhaps occasionally during the week, but never formally in the same way as they would have done in Newman's day.
This was like a religious order, in a
It was
sense.
very much like that.
Yes.
Much more like a religious order than we would perhaps have appreciated.
And most of them were Anglican clergymen in any case?
They were virtually always clergymen in holy orders. Virtually always. Even those who weren't necessarily studying theology. They would have, of course, studied theology, but they wouldn't necessarily be doing so while they continued as dons.
Right.
But they would certainly, generally speaking, be Anglican clergymen.
Yes. So, Father, what struck me was what you said about with Newman having lost some friends. I mean, he lost friends initially when he converted, because all of his Anglican brethren and all of his family as well, who sort of distanced themselves from him. So I suppose he was going to be attracted to a community rather than being a diocesan priest, because he needed that new circle of friends. He was no longer in Littlemore, he'd left those people behind. So this was something that was going to, maybe he was quite a sort of a sociable person, an amiable person who really appreciated friendship around him.
You're quite right. And that's something, again, which isn't always appreciated. When people think of Newman, very often they think of him as rather remote, cerebral, individualistic. In fact, he was none of those things at all. Only obviously he was a man of extraordinary intellectual power. That doesn't need to be explained or answered to. You know, it's quite clear. But he was other things which you don't see very clearly, because obviously he's not there to show them. He was a person of great personal warmth. He was a man who was very gifted in friendship.
Yes.
He was able to give and receive friendship.
Yes.
And that was something which, you're quite right, he felt very much the need of precisely when he lost so much on leaving the Church of England.
Right.
He realised that he couldn't cope just on his own. He needed to have the support of friends. Interestingly enough, of course, he did have some friends who remained with him over that Littlemore period.
All right.
He left behind most of those whom he knew in Oxford itself.
Yes.
So all those he'd known at Oriel, they all remained Anglicans. But the ones who came out to him, and they were younger men, to Littlemore, they weren't his contemporaries. They were all of a younger generation. They were the ones who were undergraduates when he was a don and a tutor. And they came under his influence largely because of his preaching in St Mary's Church,
right,
or sometimes because they had been taught by him, but largely I think because of his preaching. So they were drawn to him in that way because of the extraordinary power of his preaching. But they then became a little nucleus of friends at Littlemore, and many of them did in fact accompany him into the Catholic Church. And the first little nucleus of Oratorians included several of those.
Right.
And of course, One of the most important of those figures for him, of course, was Ambrose St John. And the reason why Ambrose is so important is because he was the person who remained close to Newman's side at every stage, from Littlemore through to Ambrose's own death in 1875. So that there was this extraordinary bond between them. But it was a bond of close friendship based on their unity in purpose. And I think what people very often don't realise about the importance of the bond with Ambrose is that it was based on the fact that Ambrose sacrificed himself totally for the cardinal. And given the way in which sometimes rivalries could blow up in a community, and suddenly affections might change, or indeed the purposes for which people had entered the oratory might suddenly alter. There were people coming and going all the way through the 1850s and 60s. And sometimes they would be quite, these could be quite dramatic, like the departure of Father Nicholas Darnall, for instance, who was the first headmaster of the school that Newman founded. There was a great breakup between him and Newman over the position of Mrs. Wotton, the matron. The important thing there, of course, was that Darnall led a revolt of teachers against Newman's authority.
I see.
And of course, as a result of that, Darnall had to leave the community, although he was himself quite broken by doing so. But nonetheless, he'd broken so much of the community spirit by that. But Ambrose remained faithful. Ambrose, at a moment's notice, took over the direction of the school in order to save the cardinal having to do so. So Ambrose's place was hugely important.
Yes.
And he wasn't the only one. Another thing that was very important about the early community was there were two other fathers who took on a lot of work in order to save Newman, so Newman could do a lot more of the intellectual work that he needed to do, as well as his own parochial duties. But he would have time to devote to these things. There was Father Joseph Gordon, to whom the cardinal dedicated the Dream of Gerontius. So that's why he would still be remembered now. And he died very early. He died in the 1850s as still a young man through overwork, especially through the work that he undertook in Derrit End, which was the busy city centre slum parish, really, that the oratory took on when they left Maryvale and came into central Birmingham for the first time in the late 1840s. And then there was also Father Edward Caswell, who's definitely remembered today, of course, as one of the great hymn writers. Yes. One of the best Catholic hymn writers of the 19th century. He and Frederick Faber, of course, were the two great Catholic writers. And Caswell, again, also did a tremendous amount to support Newman, and he also died young. And as a result of that, they were buried, in fact, as three side by side in Redmore. And Newman, at one point, he talks, of course, everyone remembers him talking about wanting to be buried with Ambrose, but in fact there's a memo, not so well known, but very important one, where he says that he wants to be buried with the three.
I see.
Those three who are side by side in Redmore, and significantly says, I put them there.
Right.
So he felt, you see, that he owed them a tremendous debt, that he'd brought them to an early grave because they tried to save him from having to work too hard in particular ways.
He inspired a lot of loyalty.
Yes.
And also he was a very loyal friend himself.
Precisely, yes. Yes, that's a very important point to bear in mind. And of course it's that idea of friendship which perhaps we're not quite so familiar with nowadays. Friendships are much more evanescent sort of things in many people's experience. They come and they go. But friendships were made very firmly. And of course, the rather intense kind of life that we've just been talking about in Oxford, all these celibate clergymen living together in colleges, they were very close to each other.
Yes.
They saw a lot of each other. So those who made friendships in that kind of furnace of heat, and especially, of course, in Oxford in the 1830s and early 40s, the whole of the Tractarian excitement, of course, meant that there were tremendous energies that were being generated, which caused huge ructions in the university as a whole. Indeed, it may be said that it actually precipitated the great change of the 1850s when the university decided that it had no longer to be an exclusively Anglican institution. And it could be said that in fact, Newmans and the other Tractarians' attempts to try and revivify the Anglican nature of the university could have precipitated its slide into secularity.
I see.
That certainly is one of the arguments that's made, because there was so much opposition.
Yes, yes.
And of course, when the Tractarians kind of failed to move the whole of the university in their direction, then of course it was followed by Newman, of course, and the most intellectually important of them all, moving into the Catholic Church, and the others remaining as a kind of rump in Oxford, Pusey and Keble particularly, though of course Keble moved out to a parish, as so many of them eventually did,
right.
And there was only Pusey, of the major figures, who was left in Oxford, remained Regius Professor to the end of his life. So they remained a rather smaller body than they had been perhaps at the very beginning, and that's why these loyalties and friendships were so powerful. And those who remained with Newman from Littlemore were, of course, therefore the nucleus of this new Oratorian ideal.